Attention all grill masters and backyard barbecue enthusiasts. Lynn's has everything you need to make your 4th of July cookout a success. From sizzling certified Angus beef steaks and mouth-watering burgers to fresh cut fruit and all the condiments you desire, we have you covered. Browse our weekly ad for celebratory savings like 39-cent per pound seedless watermelon through July 4th and shop online at lynsgrocery.com for extra convenience. Lynn's, where delicious begins.
Okay, it's official. We are very much in the final sprint to Election Day. And face it, between debates, polling releases, even court appearances, it can feel exhausting, even impossible to keep up with. I'm Brad Mielke. I'm the host of Start Here, the daily podcast from ABC News. And every morning, my team and I get you caught up on the day's news in a quick, straightforward way that's easy to understand, with just enough context so you can listen, get it, and go on with your day. So, kickstart your morning. Start smart with Start Here and ABC News, because staying informed shouldn't feel overwhelming.
Hey, podcast listeners. Tired of ads barging into your favorite news podcasts? Good news. With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. Stay up to date on everything newsworthy by downloading the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free news. That's amazon.com/ad-free news to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
To have a good harvest, one must plant good seeds and must also use the right kind of fertilizer. The carrots have grown large and firm. How good they will taste.
Well, happy Halloween, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very frightful day. And if you were a good listener and you decided to follow along with us and watch the movie Hold Your Breath on Hulu, that's what we're going to talk about today, because it truly was suspenseful, I think is the word Batavia used, isn't it? Yep. So before,
I'm still all wound up. Yeah.
Before we go any further, spoiler alert, if you haven't watched the movie, you're going to know the movie. You should watch it and then come back, because I didn't know going into this at all what it was about. And then I started watching it and I was like, hold up. And we went from there. So,
yeah, I didn't know of this. Basically, it's a, disaster of, a decade or so. So yeah, it was new news to me. But I blame my lack of curiosity in the public school system here in Chicago.
Yeah, I never learned about it. And what we're referring to is the Dust Bowl. I never heard about it in school. My mother actually she was watching a documentary series a couple years ago about it, and she was telling me about it. I was like, yeah, whatever. Well, then we watched this, and I was like, oh, because it's got Sarah Paulson in it. She's in American Horror Story. She played Nurse Ratched in Ratched. She's really good. She tends to go through like the horror, suspense, thriller genre, and she's a really good actor. Got to be politically correct these days. And that's what kind of brought us into it. And as I watched it, I was like, man, this is the Dust Bowl. And it made it very clear in the beginning what was going on. Well, if you don't know about the Dust Bowl, wouldn't you think we should tell people about the Dust Bowl?
I was waiting for you to take a breath to see if you're going to decide to do that.
I'm excited about it because it was good. Well, go ahead, Batavia. Tell them about the Dust Bowl.
Was that right? So what did we find out the years were? Is it, I think it's
the 1930s.
Yeah, like 30 to 36 or something. Generally speaking, the decade of the 30s, where there was a drought across a number of states in the U.S. Specifically, the focus was on places like Texas, Oklahoma, and western Kansas, some parts of Colorado, New Mexico. So there was a drought that was like a number of years in the making. And that in turn led to a lot of the soil being super duper dry. And in turn, that led to like, you think about windstorms and then think about like dry dirt blowing around in those windstorms. Some folks have described it as like the black blizzard.
Yeah.
And so there were a number of effects that are connected to what we talk about every day. Health effects, effects on people's ability to earn, to eat. It was really a dark time, no pun intended, by kind of the idea of dirt flying around for a number of years. I think that it's been noted that things started to improve notably towards the end of the 30s. So you're talking about a decade.
Yeah.
And I read this is over 1 million acres that was impacted. If you get back to like the gardening of it all, the farming of it all, 1 million acres. It's even hard for me to wrap my brain around, even naming those states, like 1 million acres.
Yeah. And I mean, when I was watching it, and we're going to talk about the movie too, but just to kind of put it into perspective for you, I started, I was doing a little bit of research because I was like, Batavia and I knew we wanted to do something where we watched a movie and talked about it on the show for Halloween. We've done it in the past. Shout out to the furniture out there, if you know what I'm saying. But we got into it and I started looking at it, and lo and behold, fact, it was a man-made disaster. That was the alarming part of it. And so basically the way it worked out was it was the beginning of World War I, and wheat harvests were like gold. They were just coming in and there was booming really big, and people were, it was just amazing. But when you started hearing about record wheat prices, people were like, we got to grow more. And when you plow, you want the rain to come because it settles that soil. Well, at the exact same time, farmers were getting gas-powered tractors for the first time, and so they just went crazy making farmland. And then coinciding with this drought, you can see because they tore up all of this virgin land, there was not enough rain and grass to hold the dirt down. And so you started to get these dust storms. And to put it in perspective right off the bat, there was a dust storm that would come through and it would bury an entire house. Like the house would be under dust. You would see the peak of the roof. So, that's what we're talking. We're not talking about, it's this little dust storm. Let's go inside for a minute. It's like, oh Lord, this is really bad. And that brings us into the movie, in which that's what it focused on. It focused on the dust and what they did in order to keep themselves healthy during this time. People were dying from breathing in the dust, not just from being trapped outside, but from actually breathing it in and getting sick from it.
And at that time, there was less of an understanding, clearly, than we have when it comes to some medical conditions, the impact of inhaling that much dust at that level of frequency and the more long-term impacts it's going to have, right? Like if you're, caught outside in the middle of one of the higher moments of the dust storm, right? Because it wasn't like dust was like whipping around all day, every day at a high intensity. Clearly there was most times dust in the air, but when you got to that high point where it's really whirling around and you get, trapped by it, well, yeah, you're going to find, people that didn't survive it, but that doesn't mean that you stayed in your house and you were healthy. Well, no, it's literally everywhere.
I found it interesting that, Sarah Paulson, the main, what was her name in the movie? Do you remember?
No, I don't remember.
Well, we're gonna have to call him by her real name. She was obsessed with cleaning her house because, it's not like a house now. There was holes in the wall, the houses breathed back then. If it was cold outside, it was cold inside. There was no insulation. If your fire went out, you was fitting to freeze. End of story. And, she was obsessive about cleaning it because she had already lost a child and she was dealing with that trauma. And what I found to be the scariest part, other than living through this, was the psychology part of it. It was really interesting because you had, she was very obsessive about cleaning and sweeping and getting the dust out and, secluding the kids and making sure that they would breathe, the cleanest air they could with what they had. And then you had another family who the lady just kind of gave up and the kids were dying. They left in a dust storm. The dust storm buried their family. I mean, it was like, trauma after trauma after trauma, which was what this whole movie was about, was just trauma building on this lady. And it was amazing to see. I mean, they were staying alive via a cow that they were just struggling to get milk from. And that milk that they got from that cow was what was keeping them alive. And it was crazy because the bedtime story she would tell was the story about how beautiful the wheat was that grew before the dust storm. And you could go outside, it looked like a nuclear war. It was truly scary to me to see that and to think that we caused that. I mean, we had a little bit of help from a drought, but you coincide those things together and it's insane.
Yeah, and I think they didn't elaborate on it and they didn't show it, but kind of 15 years ago, I probably wouldn't have drawn this conclusion. The milk was keeping them alive. That cow was keeping them alive. I'm sure there was some trading going on as well, right? It wasn't just that they were consuming milk and that's the only thing that they had. I would assume that there is some trading of other resources, some bartering that was going on.
Well, she said that it was keeping them alive. Do you remember?
Well, yeah, she said that this cow is keeping us alive, but I think that, I think the resource of the cow was my interpretation of it. And again, I can make it up to be anything I want. I assume people back then, again, you just weren't consuming milk if you had a dairy cow, right? The person that actually had a little bit more money to buy some things from wherever, maybe you're trading some milk with them. So, I mean, it's logical, right? But yeah, I mean, I think that, a part that really stuck out to me was and I don't think they share what area they were living in, right? But that's kind of beside the point. When you look at the spacing between the homes, right? There was quite a bit of distance. You're not on top of each other like we are in my city home now,
No.
So there was this distance and everything. There were so many things that were impacted, the mail, right? Clearly in that time, you didn't have news stations. You weren't turning on the television to see what was on the news. So it was a lot of word of mouth. And I found it interesting the way that their sewing circle would share information. It's like, well, this week you better be careful about this thing. And it's like horror, 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 and then the next week they don't even mention, oh, well, we figured out it's probably, some other issue. This was going back to the what do they call them? The guys and gals, they come into town. No one knows who they are. Drifters. Yeah. Thank you. So the drifter comes in town and commits this heinous act, these crimes, but nobody really saw them. It's like you're instilling fear in this conversation, right? And her character, Margaret, I think is her name. She, her husband was off working. And so she's just there with the girls, right? With her young daughters. And it's that whole, well, you better be careful. You're in that house without a man. And then I think the next week or weeks later, she asked, hey, what happened with the drifter? They're like, oh, we didn't tell you. Yeah, they're thinking that the husband killed the family.
Yeah.
And it's like how quickly you go with you're painting this story, right? The power in that moment of painting the story. And this is going to be relevant into the end of all of our days, right? And then there is a air quote correction, but you think that'd be one of the first things they would have told her when they saw her again. No, she had to ask them about it. And then it was like, just shrugging it off, forget all of the fear that every time we tell the story. And to be quite frank, the power in being that storyteller, forget all of that. Oh yeah. We're thinking he was acting off, and we still, of course, by the end of the movie, don't even know if that was true.
Yeah. I mean, I was saying to my son when we were watching it, I was like, and my wife, I was like, I'm glad we live in a time now where we don't really have to worry about drifters like that. Mm-hmm. That coming, if somebody comes into your neighborhood, I mean, you can find out some information nowadays, but I mean, imagine go back, 100 100 years, I could go up to Chicago and you would have no clue what I've done, or I could tell you any story you wanted. And if I was convincing enough, you would just have to believe it. And that's truly scary, because that guy, I mean, he came in and, you know, it had turned out that he had killed her husband and stole his stuff and everything. But he was putting on a good front and thought they were helping. And I mean, they thought that he had like some biblical, powers and stuff like that.
I thought he was a healer. He didn't kill her husband. He stole her husband's jacket, which had a letter, which allowed him to fake as if he had befriended the husband, because he knew things about them from the letter. Not only the money. He killed another guy, though, that was in whatever camp they were working and her husband was working in.
And so when he sent the letter, they found it, and, you know, all that stuff. So what I found interesting, and you go all the way, because we're going to talk about the Dust Bowl too. You go into the end of the movie and it turns out that like it was just really in her mind. You know, they had made these stories up, and she was just the trauma from living in desperation, living through death, constant death and fear of death, and all of this caused her to basically lose her mind. And yeah, the guy was real. Yeah. But the trauma of the gray man was not real. The gray man, which was, you know, the gray man, the dust that would come, and then you would inhale it and it would make you crazy. It wasn't that the dust made you crazy. It was, well, it did make you crazy, but it was the trauma of everything happened. I mean, imagine going to your neighbor's house and finding the kid buried in 2 feet of dust, you know, and the dad's laying there dead next to him, holding his hand, trying to save him. You know, these people are fleeing for their lives that have really no idea where to go. I mean, again, it's hard to believe, but imagine now you're living in something crazy in Chicago and you're like, I heard in North Carolina that the sun's out and everybody grows food there. We need to go there. And they're like, oh yeah, you heard that? It's like, you didn't see a picture. You didn't get a video of it. You didn't talk to anybody. You just heard from the guy down the street. And so you're like, I'm going to get on my horse and I'm going to ride 2,000 miles down there just to go see. I mean, that's crazy. And just to manage that, and then to look at your cow and be like, I need my milk from my cow or my family's going to die. Like, this constant pressure would just drive anybody batty.
There's one of my favorite, a bunch of favorite movies, unrelated, Wyatt Earp with Kevin Costner is one of my absolute favorite movies. I feel like because we all have this relationship, speaking to the audience in particular, you should know this, but
Hey, podcast listeners. Tired of ads barging into your favorite news podcast? Good news. With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. Stay up to date on everything newsworthy by downloading the Amazon Music app for free, or go to amazon.com/ad-free news. That's amazon.com/ad-free news to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
The Day After Tomorrow, or so, you know, one of my favorite movies, what happens when, you know, this huge event impacts a large part of the world, or the country, I should say. There was a group of people that wanted to leave what was looked at to some as a safe space when they were in New York. And they decided, we're going to head out, you know, and then if you haven't seen it by now, here's your spoiler. When the next time you see this group, they're all frozen and dead. Yeah. You know, and so you look at going back to the Dust Bowl, they were, for all intents and purposes, stuck. They didn't have the means. They didn't feel like it was safe to leave. You are literally waiting for this to blow over. They didn't give us context of how long in like months or years. We know what the true story is, right? The length of time this lasted. They didn't give us the context, but it was very clear that it had been a good while, right? So you're waiting for this to, no pun intended, blow over in this movie, right? And all you have is hope that rain's going to come. Yeah. Hope that, you know, this dust is going to settle, you know. So remember, going back to what Young Ben described as this drought and then farming practices combined led to this topsoil drying out. And because it's not being, you know, it's not, there's rain that's not coming down, it ultimately turns into this dust. And you think about how long and how much space has to be dry for this to happen to the degree that it happened.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
it's wild. And so to your point of she already had some level of a trauma. I understood it that she was sleeping separately from them because she was having night terrors even before potentially the Dust Bowl, right? So she couldn't trust what she was going to do separately from her two daughters. And by now, again, if you've watched it, you're tracking along with us. And then it took me a while. I'm a little scary. I needed to watch it during the daylight because the filming technique, you know this better than I do. It was kind of dim, just basically the whole movie. And there were parts that I fast forwarded over because I was a little bit scary. And I'm like, okay, I can go back. But it took me a while to realize that, she's in part going to be a villain in this. Yeah,
it took a long time. I thought she was going to, knowing that actress, I knew that she wasn't going to be.
You suggested this movie. We have been bouncing movies around. You suggested the movie. I didn't look a single thing up about the movie until I was set to watch it. So when I pressed play, I'm like, her? Yeah. No. She did an excellent job in the movie, though. Yes. As you kind of end up, I think she was in one of the American Horror Story seasons, and you ended up, for me, I was just like,
she's in almost all of them, I believe.
Oh, yeah, because they do reuse the actresses and actors.
So the kids, from what I understood, at the end of the movie, when they saw green, they made it, and they implied that they had never seen the color green.
That's a good point.
So I'm imagining that this was kind of towards the end of the Dust Bowl, and you're correct. She was sleeping separate because she was sleepwalking, night terrors, or whatever. But it was from her previous kid's death because of the dust that had caused her to have that trauma. So you living in that state when it's just constant. And I mean, look, if it wasn't bad enough that there was no rain for years to come and there was just these terrible dust storms, I mean, it also brought other problems like plagues of jackrabbits and grasshoppers. So, I mean, they didn't show this in the movie, but during the time frame, during this period, when the dust would come, it would bring the jackrabbits and grasshoppers, and whatever would grow. I mean, grasshoppers are like a biblical plague in a garden. I don't know if you've ever experienced them, but they come out towards the end of the season and they just destroy everything. And the people would go out and they would have rabbit drives where they would kill as many rabbits as they could, because I mean it was like a fight for your life, And what that tells me, I just got a note. Apparently I was wrong about the daughter died of scarlet fever. Yeah. Was it because of the dust though?
I love that you said you made the connection with the end of the movie, and then the father in his note mentioned, I hope this is still green when you get it. Yeah. It was beautiful and green when I picked it. So I think that you're spot on about either they had never seen it or it had been so long they didn't know if they were going to see it again. I don't think that was connected to it. I think it was just,
another trauma.
It's Chris Rock has a special from decades ago, and he's talking about, the last thing they cured was polio. Yeah. Back then there clearly diseases that we don't even think about today. So I think it was just about with scarlet fever that,
But, they would have big clouds of grasshoppers come through that reportedly were 23,000 insects per acre. Now, if you have 23,000 per acre and you had 1 million acres on the grand scheme of things, that's an insane amount. And what that tells me is, as human beings on this planet, the planet will always win. It will always win. There's nothing that we can do. I mean, the balance of life, just like in your garden, is so fragile. That it's amazing. But they would go out and they would kill as many rabbits as they could. I imagine they would eat them. I would hope
grasshoppers.
Grasshoppers or the jackrabbits. Mm-hmm. So I'm imagining a jackrabbit could be just as bad as a regular rabbit, if not worse, because they're pretty big. So, but yeah, so it was crazy, and you start thinking about that time frame where I don't think. My impression from what I've read is they didn't really know at the time, other than the drought, that they had caused the Dust Bowl situation. But you started getting people to come up and say, like, well, how do we stop this Dust Bowl? What do we do? And I mean, it's funny. There's a thing in this article that I have pulled up, and it says a New Jersey asphalt company actually suggested paving the 1 million acres of plains. Of course they did. Could you imagine if there was a 1 million acre parking lot now because we had to stop the Dust Bowl? You know how terrible that would be?
I mean, think about the states that we named and how it's crossing those states. It's yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's multiple states in it. So, then they got, let's see, they had people that were firing rockets into the air to make rain. So they wanted to carry an explosive mixture of dynamite and nitroglycerin to induce showers, which is very interesting. So are you familiar with weather modification at all, Batavia?
No.
You don't know anything about it?
I don't think so.
Okay, so this is proven fact. In the Olympics in China, I think it was 2008 maybe, they actually made clouds. They seeded clouds so that it would cool the Olympic Games down because it was so hot. Mm-hmm. And in Dubai, there's a guy every month or every couple weeks, he actually pays for them to seed clouds to make it rain. It's possible to make rain today in today's day and age to some extent, which just could probably have been, if I would imagine, would be the precipice to it. It's been going on since the 70s. Can they make crazy storms and stuff like that? I don't think so. But I know that they can influence a little bit in certain areas and take away and all that stuff. So if anybody's curious and looking into it, it's the HARRP. It's called HARP. It's an antenna array up in Alaska, I believe, that they use to kind of influence the atmosphere and the ionosphere, to be exact, because that's where radio waves interact, to create clouds and stuff like that. So, it is possible, but back then that wasn't an option at all. So you just kind of had to let it go for as long as possible until it changed. And it's the cycles of the weather patterns and stuff like that that occur that can be very dangerous to us. You know what I mean? So, for instance, we didn't get any rain in June this year. We got a tropical storm. We got a bunch of rain. And then we got a little bit of rain. Then we got another tropical storm. We haven't had any rain in like 6 weeks. Not a drop of rain in 6 weeks. And we don't have any more rain coming for at least 2 more weeks in the forecast. So it's crazy. Yeah. Like, we're in this weird thing where it's like we get a lot of rain and then we don't.
But there have been so many things that have been done over the many decades since something like the Dust Bowl that, your soil just doesn't crumble for 6 weeks. And during the Dust Bowl, even, it wasn't that there was no rain whatsoever. So I have in my notes that, let's say this region normally gets about 20 inches of rain a year. They were getting 15 inches or even less, right? So it wasn't that it was like zero precipitation. It was that it was at such a low level that here you are, fold in the practices that we talked about for farming and such. And to start with, it wasn't a green area to begin with. Yeah. Right. So let's go back to that, so I think that it's almost like, this was bound to happen, so to speak, but hindsight is 2020.
It is 2020. And I mean, lessons learned, you know what I mean? By the way, did you know that there is 2 times the likelihood of this occurring again than in this day and age?
Okay, it's official. We are very much in the final sprint to Election Day. And face it, between debates, polling releases, even court appearances, it can feel exhausting, even impossible to keep up with. I'm Brad Milkey. I'm the host of Start Here, the daily podcast from ABC News. And every morning, my team and I get you caught up on the day's news in a quick, straightforward way that's easy to understand with just enough context so you can listen, get it, and go on with your day. So, kickstart your morning. Start smart with Start Here and ABC News, because staying informed shouldn't feel overwhelming.
Hey, podcast listeners. Tired of ads barging into your favorite news podcasts? Good news. With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. Stay up to date on everything newsworthy by downloading the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free news. That's amazon.com/ad-free news to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Yeah, it's like a super high probability that the Dust Bowl could occur again in a grander scale. So that's
in what area?
I believe in the same area, and I can't remember the other one, but it is a grander scale. So I don't know what that comes up to be. So it's very
not on
interesting.
my bingo card of disaster that I have to think about.
No,
Yeah, but
you definitely want to stay away from it. And the reason why I brought up the weather modification stuff is because there's a lot of things going on about hurricanes and stuff right now. There's science to what occurred. So that's not necessarily the case. But if you look at what happened in like Asheville, North Carolina and stuff like that, there is like legit honest science that occurred, and it just was a bad scenario. But these things have happened in the past, which is really important. I know like South Dakota, maybe either south, north. I'm sorry if you live there. I get them confused. Forgive me. They're in one of the worst droughts in the country right now themselves. So, it happens all over the place. I mean, hell, a couple of years ago, we were watching lakes dry up in California and Nevada and stuff, and now they're filling back up. So it's all cyclical, which brings up the conversation just to touch on about climate change. And so climate change isn't necessarily what I've always read and heard is this, not necessarily like the heat's rising. It's extremes, like really dry, really wet, really hot, really cold. Like the in between kind of gets murky.
The number of records that we continually break in different fronts related to the climate.
But it's not just about heat. It's just across the board. So it's really interesting.
I do want to go back, and while I haven't studied specifically, what's happened in Asheville, obviously there's a lot of coverage around it. I do think it's worth noting that one more area that's man-made is like certain areas and how they're impacted by it.
Right.
What those areas are made up of. We were looking at a map a couple of episodes ago, just before the episode, like how those areas are made, what's built in those areas, how close they are to the ocean, who lives in those areas, so that's for a conversation on a different day. But it's not beyond me that we, the people, right, have a lot more control over the impact, and in the case of the Dust Bowl, would have had control over like its occurrence to begin with.
I mean, isn't that fascinating that we like magnified that problem dramatically?
That's a good descriptor of it. Yeah.
And I mean, you said they get 20 inches of rain and they got 15 inches of rain, but they took away the grasslands that absorbed the water and held it in place. And, that's what made it so bad. But then not only did you have that, but then you had like fierce electricity storms and the dust clouds. It's like it just gets worse and worse, man.
When it doesn't rain, it pours.
Yeah. So, I mean, and they didn't, I was actually, once I read about that, I was kind of sad they didn't show that. I think that would have been kind of cool just to like an extra fear effect. But, imagine going out and having a terrible dust storm and then having lightning and stuff like that within that dust storm. I mean, it's like at that point, what do you do? You know what I mean? Like, what are we supposed to do? Good job.
Sorry, I was pulling up something. You're not going to pull that out. It's just in there.
It's just in there. But I mean, what would you do if you had to deal with that, Batavia?
Well, I mean, I think that there's intuition that folds in, right? There is, unfortunately and fortunately, there is kind of the community mind of it all. You know, what other people have recommended, what they hear from their forefathers or regarding, you know, oh, this particular thing has happened before. I think that, you know, going back to the movie, you know, I feel like I'd continue to fight the good fight. Like I wouldn't lie down like the aunt did. Well, you know, unfortunately she ended up being put down, but before there was a moment where she had just given up, you know.
Yeah.
So I feel like, it'd be my hope that I'd have enough intuition and just drive to kind of fight through it. What would I do in the moment? Like when it exactly happens, probably hide.
Yeah.
You know, take cover, you know?
I mean, imagine that stress that we put on you, though. You're like, oh, gosh, I'm going to breathe the dust. Okay, now I'm going to get shocked by lightning. Okay, now I'm going to get swarmed by grasshoppers. Great. Oh, now I'm going to get my feet chewed off by jackrabbits that are coming through. Great. You know, it's just like one thing after another. And I mean, the problem with the static storms, the lightning storms and stuff is back then, it would short out the cars. So you would, and I mean, look, a car was not a very common thing to have, but if you had one, and then it didn't work. So then you're taken back and, you know, you've lost everything there and you got to keep going. So it's crazy to think about, you know, throughout the whole thing, they were saying the kids were complaining to the mom that they didn't go with their father, who was, I believe, in Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken, doing some kind of like bridge building or something where there was not this issue. And the whole time I'm watching the movie, I'm just like, you should get on the damn train. Get on the train, like figure it out, you know? I mean, because at that point, the desperation is so bad and it's so abysmal, the outlook. It's like, you've got to find a way out of there. And it's funny because it's like one bad decision and it's just, it all unravels from there. You know what I mean? But they said that there was a dust storm that was really, really bad and it reached the Atlantic Ocean. But like on the East Coast, it wasn't a big deal. You know, people just cleaned a little bit more or whatever. But there, it was really bad because your house was buried. It was basically a blizzard.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the how much is true and how much isn't. Remember, one of the sewing ladies shared, oh, you know, there was so much dust, it got up on the tracks and up under the train, and the train just slid on off the tracks, you know. So yeah. I think that experiencing a situation that you've not experienced before, I think it's so interesting how so many things of the past mirror things of today. You don't have the means to leave.
Yeah.
All right. You know, those that do have, right, you know, in a lot of situations, it's not everywhere. But everyone's experience isn't exactly the same. You know, people begin to share what they heard, right? And that influences what you do or don't do. You know, I think that for sure, there's always a level of resourcefulness that, you know, people lean on, and that's a large part of what gets you through it. It seemed that they, in the movie, didn't play up as much on community. Like, sure, there were more than just, you know, Margaret or, you know, real life Sarah and her daughters in the movie. There was more than that, but there wasn't as much community leaning in and helping, you know, like it's a part of the story that they were telling, you know, which I get. But I'm all but certain that there was less fatalities associated with it because community stepped in, you know. This one of the saddest parts, there were some sad parts, I mean, a number of them, was when and I didn't pick up on that was their aunt, the other woman, and
I don't know if it was their aunt or just like a close friend that they called aunt.
Yeah. And so when she had just been in a stupor, and you know, the main character tells the sheriff she's not fit. which, was clearly a term that was used back then, right? And so she's like, I would take them, but I can't afford to feed them. And that really that was such a stark line. I had to go back and say, make sure I'm hearing this right.
Yeah.
I literally, I want to do the right thing, but I can't afford to feed them, it's jarring almost,
I mean, it was like fallow land. You couldn't grow anything. And one thing I was thinking about too, because as soon as I started watching it and I figured out what was going on and the story behind it, I was like, all right, we're going to talk about this on the episode. Like, I'm going to twist Batavia's arm, do it, which I didn't have to do. But I started thinking about it and I was like, okay, back then, farming, people don't realize now that farmers are the cornerstone of America. You know what I mean? It's like, you grow food. This is where our food comes from. It's really important. And back then, I mean, it was even more so. We depended on farmers across the board. But as I was watching it, and clearly there was no wheat or anything like that. I wished, and this is pretty selfish for our parts, but I was wishing that they would bring it up and say like something along the lines of like, we can't even have a garden for ourselves or anything, because they had their piece of land, and I imagine that people were not right up on top of each other because they were living on their farmland, and they had all of this land that they were using, but they were using it for cash crops, not survival crops, right? And I understand, like, at the time there's no rain, or very little rain, too much dust in the sky, because you got to think too, with all the dust in the air, it was filtering out the sunlight as well. So you probably did, full sun was not really a thing for the most part. But I was wishing that they had showed something like this, because this whole time frame starts to really, this is the Depression, this is World War I going into World War II. And what is a big thing that was occurring in World War II? Victory gardens. And so, it just kind of, unfortunately there's a little, and I know it was a little bit before that, but even showing that aspect of it would have been interesting to me, because I'd hate to think that if you lived in the 30s and you lived out in the middle of nowhere and you had a big farm, that you didn't have at least a little plot cut out for you to grow some food for yourself. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that, we talk about, when folks talk about, I'm not able to grow a garden. And in some cases, it's the expense of it. But a lot of cases, what I hear is I don't have the land to do it in. I'm renting, or, the area that, the home that I live in just doesn't have the space to dedicate to it. We don't often talk about, fallow land, right? Like, It's just like, no, there's no real good growing space here. Like, hard stop. And and maybe it's just a blessing that it's very hard to imagine that.
Yeah. Well, because it got to a point to where the government actually came in, they stepped in and they said, okay, we got to stop this. And so what they ended up doing is the government purchased starving livestock for $1 a head. So each cow was $1, basically. And then if they were healthy enough to be butchered, they could get up to $16 a head. And then the meat was used to feed homeless people and stuff like that. And then the Soil Conservation Service, established in 1935. So around this time frame, clearly this is what started this area of the government. They paid farmers to actually leave the ground idle. Don't plant your farm. And then they started using land management techniques such as crop rotation. And what everybody loves this, and we're gonna talk about this coming up shortly, native prairie grass. We're not going to talk about grasses, but native plants and stuff like that. So that was the big issue, is when they tore the grasslands away, they took all the native plants out of there. So you didn't have that. So then they, crop rotation would bring it in, it helped build the soil back up. You had to find ways to stop the dust. Mm-hmm, it was just stop the dust. How can we do it? And if you can't get anything to grow, what can we do? But at the same time, if you plant native, it's already got a better chance to grow in that area because it's kind of built within its, genetics to handle the droughts, the dryness, or the overly wetness, or the amount of sun, or anything like that. So,
yeah, I think again, it's the, how should I say this? And I'm okay with being a little bit controversial here. Okay. So COVID is an example of it impacted all of the U.S. It impacted the world, right? And so the response to something like that is very different than something significant impacting a pocket of our country. So you can lean back to, any of the huge hurricanes over the last, for our lifetime, right? How the rest of the world has basically watched or heard about it, watched it, on TV, read about it in newspapers, because those are still a thing. And you think about something like this that's impacting a part of the country, but the rest of the country is quite literally green.
Yeah.
Right. And so I didn't come across anything that framed it up as slow to respond, but I'm certain there was a slow response, right? And then how much experience did we have to say, okay, these are solutions? Years this thing went on, years.
Yeah, I was going to look up something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that that as I was watching it, it was pretty early on. I saw the connection to the work that we do, the time that we spend, our purpose as it relates to gardening and growing. And I'm curious about 15 years ago, if I would have watched this, my takeaway from it. Clearly my views on a lot of things as it relates to growing have evolved. I had a garden 15 years ago, but I don't think that I had the head space that I have now, to see how connected things are.
Yeah. You were saying something about them being slow to respond. I was looking up how long it took, because, you got to think there wasn't a lot of communication. I mean, there was telegraphs and stuff like that. And there was radio. But let's say you just sent a letter. I mean, it took 4 or 5 days just to get it there, where now it's just a couple days. You know what I mean? And then that's if it even made it. That's if the guy's horse didn't get sick. That's if the train didn't break down. There's a lot of variables. So, but yeah, I think that there was a little bit of a slower response. But I don't think it was horrible, because what ended up happening is the government bought about 10 million acres of land and converted them over to grasslands, and they're still grasslands to this day. So they still manage them. And that's really important too. I mean, they made it because I think, it was Teddy Roosevelt. He was really big into the national park system and made a bunch of different parks that are still to this day managed, and why they are protected was because of him. And I would imagine that it came from this, because, I think this was the first time in history that I can recall that we actually, as a human race, were able to say, this is something that we caused. We changed this and made this a problem. We've got to fix it, So it's interesting to me. Yeah,
I think that it shouldn't go. I mean, we don't want to not say this. All things aren't created equal when it comes to what this disaster was across the states that were impacted. Some were more heavily impacted than others. And I think slow to respond is relative, right? Because it's how long does it take to recognize that this is as bad as it was, right? So I think you trickle in all of the communication that we have today is nowhere near what it was then, right? This wasn't the first perceived weather event, right? We know that. We had already, 1930, we had already been through, a plague, 1911, right? So it wasn't that, horror and the impact on citizens that existed, long before this, but this is a unique type of situation. And, you think about, I'd love to see specifically get those drones out, specifically the areas that were impacted and what they look like today. I'd love to see that on video.
What it looks like today.
Before and current. Yeah. Like specifically those areas, not just, Kansas, not just, New Mexico. Because obviously we know that there's civilization in all of those areas. The states, that is.
Have you tried to look it up at all?
No, because it just came to my mind.
Oh, well, I just looked it up. Mm-hmm. Here, you want to see what it looks like?
Yeah, why not?
Let me share my screen with you. So I've got a picture here of oops. What is this?
Yeah,
There you go.
even without you saying that the likelihood of it happening in on a bigger scale, even without you saying that, I do think there's power in just being aware, even at this like surface level, to be quite frank, of something like this. And again, how much we played into the beginning, the management of it, and the after.
So here's an article by the WWF, the World Wildlife Federation, or Foundation, excuse me, I'm thinking of wrestling. How dare they steal the name? Let me just
That's
say.
literally the reason why they're no longer the WWF for wrestling.
I know. So yeah, this is it. And they're talking, this is the same area. And it's saying the next Dust Bowl, Great Plains grasslands loss slows overall, but rises in South Dakota. So, I mean, maybe this could be another area, like we said in the beginning, earlier, it's a high chance. So, it's very, very scary to think about. So, overall, I thought the movie, it was good in itself, but being a gardener, and then once I realized that it was like a man-made situation, it made it, to me, like it was a little bit nerve-wracking, I would say. What did you think?
Well, I mean, I think that even without being a gardener, it's an interesting movie. It's a short watch, all things considered. I think that the darkness, quite figuratively and literally, is like pluck a point of time out and watch it in today's world with today's eyes. I definitely recommend it. I have a watch list. So I take from that watch list to recommend different things to different friends and family. And so I wouldn't make this a carte blanche recommendation, right? I pick and choose who I recommend this to, because it still is like 90 minutes or something. I don't know, what is it, 75 minutes or something like that. As a gardener, like, it's hard for me to believe that you're still here in the episode if you hadn't watched it already.
Yeah.
or more specifically, when you heard about what we'd be talking about, you may have started poking around to learn more about the Dust Bowl. And if you did that, I think it'd be pretty cool if you have an opportunity to watch the movie.
Yeah.
I always love the, fiction of it all, but then like how many documentaries have I, like dramatizations have I watched, and then I'm out there searching like, was this true? Did this really happen?
And that's the idea. That's the idea of it too. I mean, we didn't really get into the urban legend aspect of it and the way rumors spread. We want to leave that out there, but definitely want to look into that. And look, I mean, we talked about crop rotation in here, and the reason why it's so important is because the Planter app shows you crop rotation. It helps you deal with that. We're going to talk about the Planter app real quick because they are a sponsor of the show for a good reason. They have an amazing app. It's a drag and drop interface that you can click through. It shows you everything that you do. And look, you don't want to create a miniature dust bowl in your yard, right? So definitely want to use it. Like you said, they started using crop rotation. So you can go through your past garden plans that you've made and then switch through them, look and see which one's which, how you can rotate your crops to be most effective, and use a drag and drop interface. They have the red and green dots that will help you to determine what is combative and what is companion. And then also different types of like mulches that you can put on there visually, so you can keep track of, you use wood in one bed and grass in another and hay in another one. And you can use all that stuff to your advantage. Thousands of varieties. It's available on the Apple and Google Play Store. Check the link below to get yourself a discount on it. It is a great app. It is currently and always has been updated and features added to it. It's grown into an absolute monster that is a cornerstone of our gardens. So check out the Planter app. That's the PLANTER app. All right, I got a question for you. So this question comes from the Backyard Gardens Community Garden on Facebook. Come join us and send us a question on there if you'd like. Carrie writes,
Hey, Carrie.
how do I better plan and implement multiple plant types into one bed? While I do have 4 different raised beds, all 4x8, I don't want only 4 separate crops. I want 20, LOL. Example, instead of 6 tomatoes in one bed, I'd like to do 3. But what do I plant to share space, and how does that affect my watering and fertilization? There is a whole lot in that question.
Yeah, my head's getting foggy with the questions that we reviewed for an episode, the questions we've covered in an episode. I'm like, we talked about this. No, we didn't talk about this on air. All right, what do you think, young Ben?
Oh, you're going to leave it up to me?
Yeah,
okay.
Like if we were still doing mini-sodes, I know. This would be a perfect one. Actually, it's probably longer than a mini-sode, but go on.
It is. So very quickly, we literally, before we read this question, we just told you how to do it. And honestly, the planter app helps with that. It's all about that companion and combative planting is one aspect of it. The other aspect is learning how plants grow and what plays well together. You obviously don't want to put something that's going to overshadow another plant in, anything like that. I like to monocrop my beds, and I realize that I am one of few who like to do that. I know that the majority, and I would go as high to say 90-95% of the gardeners do intermingle plants inside of their garden beds. And so there's all different ways you can do it. So what you want to do is you want to look for like plants that have like fertilization, like watering needs, and you want to plant those together. But again, look up and read about companion and combative planting. We've talked about that on the show before. We've talked about it on our YouTube channels, stuff like that. But it's all about the spacing, and it's all about plant requirements. And you just have to, the thing that's in this day and age is kind of tough is you have to just kind of figure it out. And that's my opinion. You got to just kind of work through it. You've got to plant the stuff and see how it plays. There's simple rules, and I have a simple rule is you don't plant your cabbage and your tomatoes on the same day. That's just end of story, right? So you can eliminate that, but you go through your summer plants, and then you can narrow it down from there. For instance, like one combination that I have used before and I will use again is tomatoes and peppers. They play very well together. They're the nightshade family. They have light fertilization, light needs, and watering needs. So they play very well together. And then other than that, depending on what you do, you just kind of got to play a little bit and read a little bit about each crop and how they handle growth. What about you, Batavia?
So a couple of things I'll add, and I do plant my tomatoes and peppers together, but they are flagged on the planter app because they compete for nutrients. And the thing about the planter app or anything you read about, I wouldn't consider them combative, is you now have information to adjust for it. And that leans more into what young Ben does when it comes to monocropping. And I've been doing it and never called it that because probably it almost feels like a nasty word oftentimes when we think about it for farmers. I typically plant a lot of the same things together because I want to grow that quantity of a thing, and it's easier for me to manage like things than more of an interplanted bed. So the only other things I'll add on to Ben's list of spacing, not just when you're sowing a seed, or when the plant is transplanted, but how big that crop will get, from the point of it being fully mature. So considering that, time to harvest is something to consider, and access to when you're planting multiple plants within the same space. And you also mentioned, season, right? So the easier way, I believe, is to plan multiple things in a single bed that are growing and maturing for the same season. right? So does it mean that you at some point won't have summer and fall plants in at the same time? No, you can if that's your jam. But we talk about the how and what's the easiest path to success. I think it's what you described, Ben, and then those few additions. Watering needs and nutrition needs are probably overlooked, but are really, really, really important.
Yeah, I mean, it's important because there's a lot of intricacies throughout the seasons and the plants and stuff like that. And I can't remember how I stumbled across the tomatoes and peppers. I think one year I read about it and I planted it and I was like, wow, they did really amazing. And then the next year I read that it wasn't a companion plant. And so I just kind of went off of my experience. And I think that's really important, is using your experience. So
yeah, when I first had the space where the cage maybe sits now, again, 30 feet by about 4 feet, before there were any raised beds there, when I was just planting in ground, I wanted to grow tomatoes and peppers, and I had this one space to do it in. So it was like naivete, if you will, right? I planted there. They, both seemed to do fine. And so I continued, even as I expanded, to do that. Tomatoes will grow, for the most part, taller than many peppers will. This is the only year I've ever had trouble with that particular combo, but it was the space that I grew it in.
Yeah.
That's why when you say like you kind of have to just play around with it, it's absolutely the case, because all garden beds, the 4 garden beds that Carrie has, they aren't created equal, meaning they're not going to be the same, no matter that they're 4x8, same as young Ben's, because his weather is different. The orientation of those beds may be different, meaning they get more or less sun. Like all of those things matter. So I think it's an interesting question, because it's one of those things that I think you and I may take a little bit for granted, because we figured out how to plant things together and the desire to plant, how to plant different things together, and then where we lean more so towards planting like things together.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to plant families together. Mm-hmm. And that's really, I find that works for me. The nutritional needs are generally the same. It's when you start getting outside of the box that it gets very difficult. So I would stick to, if you really want to intermingle plants within your beds, try to stick to family likenesses in plants.
Yeah, just 2 comments on that, maybe unrelated to Carrie's question, but a couple of things that stick out when you talk about planting families together is same disease, same pests, and depleting the soil. And so you manage around those things. I just thought to myself, I wonder if it has worked as well as it has for you, in part because you get crops in and out so fast.
I don't know. Maybe.
I'm thinking it definitely doesn't hurt your efforts.
Well, I mean, I don't let them linger, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, when they're done and they're out. I mean, yeah, so, but, you're also always trying to amend soil and work it and, feed and all that stuff. But I remember when I put my tomatoes and peppers together the first time, I was shocked at the difference that they grew. They just did really well. So,
I still don't necessarily believe that they perform better if they were planted together than planted apart. But I have had no issues, with the exception of this year. And that was absolutely tomatoes shading out peppers.
Yeah.
That was the only issue I had. But in previous years, kind of along the same design, but just in a different set of beds, I've had great success with it.
And the thing is, with diseases and pests being similar, it means it's easier to treat the whole bed. You don't have to spot treat, so
yeah.
That's how I look
lemonade.
at it. But thank you, Carrie, for your question. I hate that we can't just give you like a definite answer, but there's so many combinations. It's one of those things that just start narrowing it down, and within the next year, multiple seasons, you'll figure it out. You'll start to get combos that you like. If you'd like to be like Carrie and send us a question, you can do so through the Backyard Gardens Community Garden on Facebook, or you can send us an email through bygquestion@gmail.com. There is no S at the end of question, but if you check the link below and all the links, you can find that. You can find our Amazon page in which we have all of our products that we use in our gardens and we recommend to you. Nothing that we take a chance on. We also have our seed shop that you can buy seeds from us. Our new seeds should be coming out within the next week or two. So please favorite that shop, check it out, and come back because we will be releasing a special discount code for that. So do not miss the opportunity to get next year's seeds early. Only available to early seed buyers for next year. And did I miss anything else, Batavia? I don't think so.
Why do we do this?
Because we want to learn to grow and grow for change.
See ya.
Now you know why people feel like celebrating at harvest time.
All over the world, people have feasting and good times when the crops have been gathered in.
Well, we hope you enjoyed the show, and thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to support the show, you can do so by checking out our seed shop below. We have all kinds of seeds available for you, and we're going to be adding new seeds shortly, so check that out. Get yourself some seeds. It's free shipping, over $35 orders. So go ahead, get a full garden. What are you waiting for? Order your seeds and stock up. Or you can become a subscriber. You can either be an Apple subscriber or a patron, and that will help support the show. You'll get one free episode every month, an extra episode, that is. So we definitely would love to see you over there and become part of our crew. Join the Backyard Gardens Community Garden in Facebook. That's free. Go ahead, join that, and join the community where all the listeners get together and they can help each other out with their trials and tribulations and just show off their gardens. There's not a better way to do it. And if you're curious about what's going on in our gardens, you can check out our individual YouTube channels. So I'm at Sandy Bottom Homestead, and Batavia is at Be Better Garden. You can check that out and see how each of us are growing and what we talk about on those, because a lot of times we will coincide with the podcast and help add information in that maybe we didn't get out in the show or we feel that's pertinent at a certain time of year. So check that out and enjoy seeing our gardens and what we do in them. And we have an Amazon store which has all the products that we use and recommend in our gardens, and it helps support our show. And we also add to this list periodically, so be sure to check it out periodically to see if there's anything that you need for your garden. Everything that you do, including a like and a subscribe and even a review, will help us learn to grow and grow for change.
See ya.